Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson analyzes how projections of lower U.S. winter wheat production have affected prices. Loren Giesler describes why stormy conditions are favoring soybean seedling diseases. Tamra Jackson-Ziems talks about bacterial diseases in corn, and Brad Lubin discusses GM labeling on food products. Al Dutcher will be in with his weekly weather forecast later in the show, but it has been a stormy week across many areas of Nebraska. DTN senior ag meteorologist Bryce Anderson noted the Nebraska storm systems Monday and Tuesday produced more tornadoes than the state of Oklahoma had all year. Heavy rains in those systems and in other cells days before shifted a larger portion of Nebraska out of drought classification. The latest U.S. drought monitor from UNL shows nearly 45% of the state is in no drought classification. It's the largest percentage since May 29, 2012. However, past storms and repeated rains are causing issues in some corn and soybean fields. We'll look at those problems in a few minutes. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our marketing analyst this week. The USDA's June crop report painted a grim picture for the U.S. winter wheat crop. The agency is forecasting production will be down 10% from last year. The output from Kansas, the country's #1 grower, is projected 24% lower than 2013. Nearly two-thirds of that crop is now rated as poor to very poor. But one of the biggest drops is expected in Oklahoma, where the agency expects farmers will produce nearly 44% less than last year on an average yield of 18 bushels per acre. On the other hand, the biggest increase from 2013 to 2014 is estimated in North Dakota. The USDA believes that state will raise its winter wheat harvest by 275%. Frayne joined us Thursday morning, and we started by looking at the progress of the U.S. winter wheat harvest.
Well, obviously we started in Texas, Oklahoma. The last report we got on crop progress was that the Texas crop was about 40% harvested, the Oklahoma crop about 50% harvested, not quite 50%. Crop quality is coming out pretty good, which again, a little bit higher proteins than we expected. Test weights are holding up reasonably well. The higher protein content, of course, is primarily because of some drought stress. Kind of the issue we're facing right now is with the storms that have been coming through the southern plains the last several weeks. Is there going to be some additional crop quality issues we need to worry about? Falling numbers is usually the first thing that shows up as a problem. Possibly later on some sprout damage. The market will be watching for that, but the expectation is, the yields are not as good as last year, obviously. Field reports are coming in about what we expected from a yield standpoint. Again, not good, but we're within the range of what the expectations were.
Yeah, it was a tough growing season for states like Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. Overall, winter wheat production is down 10%. How have those two things affected prices?
Well, locally, of course, everybody's looking at what's happening locally, and it's really easy to get stuck in what's happening in my backyard is what's happening in the rest of the world, and that's not the case, especially in the wheat market. So if you look globally what's going on right now, the U.S. is one of the areas that is having some production problems. The rest of the world currently in their wheat production cycle is in really good shape. You look at the European Union, and that's a very big wheat producing region. They're having a good crop. Their expectations are for higher yields. USDA did adjust those numbers in the last WASDE report. You look at the Black Sea region, Russia, the winter wheat crop in Russia is looking in pretty good shape right now. Ukraine is in pretty good shape. So really, worldwide, the U.S. is the one that's having the problem. And as a result, a big corn crop, or at least the expectation of a big corn crop, is putting some pressure on feed usage for wheat domestically. And you look internationally, and it looks like we have some headwinds in the international markets with a lot of competition. So the futures market's starting to take some money out. They have for the last several weeks. And I know coming into harvest, there tends to be a little bit of harvest pressure, although most farmers are bidding a lot of their wheat for right now and waiting to see what happens in the future.
I just want to make one quick note on North Dakota. That state has the biggest increase in winter wheat production, expected winter wheat production. Why is that, Frayne?
Well, last year we had a lot of prevent plant. We had a very, very wet spring. There was a lot of acres in the state that didn't get seeded. Coming into fall, a lot of that did dry up. One of the requirements for prevent plant is that you have a cover crop or some kind of cover planted. Farmers in this region have learned the hard way that it really pays to have some kind of crop growing on that land to be able to use up some of the moisture. Winter wheat makes a really good alternative. You plant it in the fall, you come back the next year, and you can get the land back into shape and be prepared for the following year. So we tend to see some pretty wide swings in the winter wheat acreage in North Dakota. It's not a big acreage crop for us, but we do have significant acres, and it swings quite a bit depending upon what the previous year's moisture outlook was like.
Has weather been conducive for spring wheat planting and growth in states including North Dakota?
Well, we've been struggling a little bit to get the crop in. It's been, as a joke, or a friend of mine said, it's been steady in spurts. There's been we get a week or so of very good progress, and then all of a sudden it would rain again. And so our crop planting progress is very spread out this year. There are areas that are going to have some prevented plant again, not as much as last year, but we are going to have some prevent plant. For the crop that is up and growing, the conditions look really good. We have some light disease pressure starting to show up, but that's typical this time of year, and farmers are doing the best they can to try and get out and spray and control that. As we look north of the border, similar conditions. Most of the Canadian crop is in right now. There is a pocket in eastern Saskatchewan, western Manitoba that's had some problems similar to what we had in North Dakota, but in most of the growing region in Canada, they've made very good planting progress, pretty much finished up with everything. Crop condition looks good.
June 30th, two big reports from the USDA, the first on quarterly grain stocks and the second on planted acres. What numbers will you be looking at there, Frayne?
Well, there's a couple of things we're going to be focusing in on the planted acreage. Of course, we're still trying to figure out how many acres of corn and soybeans are going to be planted and what that relationship will be. And so that'll be the first issue. And I think the soybean number will get the most attention. We know that they're going to be up from last year. It's just a matter of how much larger. The second would be, on the quarterly stock side, is how quickly are we using up old crop soybeans. And the old crop soybean balance sheet is getting very, very, very tight. Big concern about how many bushels are left within the system and how many do we have to work with moving forward.
Next week, Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag will join us to discuss the upcoming June 30th USDA reports on quarterly grain stocks and planted acreage. Iowa State Extension livestock economist Shane Ellis will also be with us to discuss cattle markets. As of the latest USDA crop progress report, Nebraska was the only state in the country to have completed its soybean planting. Unfortunately, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, severe weather has negatively impacted many growing regions of the state. We talked with UNL Extension plant pathologist Loren Giesler on campus Wednesday. Loren said the weather Nebraska has experienced could lead to problems in some of the state's soybean fields.
Well, yeah, and all the stormy conditions we're having really favoring some seedling diseases in soybeans right now that we're seeing. So when we're looking at those in those fields where they've had any of those conditions, heavy rain events, hail, windstorms, really going to favor, some of our pathogens that are in a lot of fields out there, the Pythiums, the Rhizoctonia, the Fusarium.
Last time we talked a lot about Pythium. It was a lot cooler then. Are we warm enough to be out of the ballpark for that one?
Well, the soils are warming, but still we're seeing some Pythium still come in the lab. So I think in some situations where those beans were out there and because of the cool temperatures staying, we had some Pythium infection that then even after the fact that soil temperatures warm up, we see the beans taken off, and with the storm conditions that favors some infection that way. Now the ones that I see though with these warmer soil temperatures are going to be more common now. I expect to see more Rhizoctonias coming in. I expect to see more on the Fusarium side. Pathogens that are stress in well-drained soils. Now, if we're in fields where we've got those eroded hillsides, more fine textured soils, more clay in the soil, then in those situations we're still going to be dealing with some pythiums, and then we might even start seeing more Phytophthora, especially with these heavy rain events in some areas.
How do you differentiate between these 4 diseases, Loren?
Well, I was just talking to our diagnostician this morning, and I think the biggest problem is looking at a picture of those, you just really can't tell most of the time. The only exception is going to be Phytophthora. And Phytophthora is going to have those dark lesions on the outside of the stem that are going to extend from the soil line up. So you'll see that brown discoloration, not to be confused with that purple stem coloration in some of the varieties, but we'll see that. And then also when you split that stem on a younger bean, a lot of times you'll see some dark discoloration on the inside of the stem in the center. So that's the only time you can really feel confident with a diagnosis on that. You can guess, because if you got well-drained soils, most of the time you're going to be dealing with Rhizoctonia, then Fusarium second, and then in the clay soils, Pythiums and Phytophthors, but you'll see them overlap too, just depending on how it goes. So I really encourage our growers to make sure they're getting it identified correctly. If they've got a good agronomist they're working with, a lot of them know how to identify these. If not, and they can't get it confirmed, send it to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic.
We're mid to late June. If a farmer was hailed out or rained out and decides that he or she does want to go in and replant, should they treat seed before they plant?
Well, if they've had significant disease problems in that field, and that's the reason why they're going to do a replant, if the soil temperatures, are above 60, 60 is optimum for germination. So I'm not too concerned about that. The only exception to that is going to be Phytophthora. If you've got a field with Phytophthora, then I'd make sure you're treating that field because above 60 degrees is still optimum for that pathogen too. So in general, the beans are going to come out quick. You really don't have to treat it. A lot of people say to, because you're going back into a field that had disease, but it's there all the time anyway. But again, it's the stress that's causing it. If you don't have the stress, they're going to come up and be fine, but if it's Phytophthora, make sure you're treating.
Are treatments recommended for standing beans that have confirmed diseases?
Really not. There's no data. Different ones comment on using foliar fungicides and things like that. These early bean fields that are injured, stressed, I would not put that investment in there. There's no data that supports that idea in any way. It makes, it kind of sounds okay because it's going to improve the health and make the beans, supposedly defend themselves, but no data that suggests that's true, especially at these earlier stages. I wouldn't do that. Once we get into R3, those timings where we tend to see some yield advantages, that's when I'd consider those things.
Well, this could be an extreme situation for a lot of Nebraska with the multiple inches of rain we've seen. How do you document this and judge the next time you come in with soybeans whether or not these diseases are going to be there?
Well, you really can't. That's the hard part. Now, the ones that you can know, if you've had any history at all, and history-wise for replant, probably, when I talk to people, if you've had a stand issue 1 in 4 or 5 years, it's probably significant enough that you're going to want to manage that. So I would just, document it, look back history. If it's new ground to you and you don't know, I would sure treat going into the next year if you're having these problems. And the biggest one, though, to document is going to be the Phytophthora, because then you can select resistant and tolerant varieties. You can do some things in the fall to start planting that next season in that field.
On our website, we'll link to information on UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic in case you're interested in submitting samples for analysis of soybean seedling diseases. Nebraska's corn crop, meanwhile, slipped in the latest USDA condition ratings. It dropped 4 points in the best 2 categories of good to excellent and increased 3 points in poor to very poor categories. While some of that deterioration is likely from recent storm damage, some repercussions from hail and heavy rains areas of Nebraska experienced earlier in the season are now starting to show. UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems joined us Wednesday afternoon near York to discuss some of the problems farmers might be seeing in those affected fields.
Well, in the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic, we're beginning to see several different bacterial diseases show up. And this is kind of what we predicted early on, and it's probably coming from fields that were hit by that first flush of hail and severe weather back, 3 weeks ago or so.
Gosses wilt is one of them?
Unfortunately, we are beginning to see some Gosses wilt, and more alarmingly, the Gosses wilt that we've seen so far is from plants that were infected very young. And those plants are becoming systemically infected, and some of them are actually dying prematurely. It's not terribly common yet, but there are some examples around the state.
You touched on this, but why is the systemic part of it so important to know?
Well, plants that become infected early, especially before the 6-leaf or V6 stage, have their growing point and all of their nodes still packed very tightly together at or below the soil line. If any one of those nodes becomes infected, all of them can become infected, and we talk about a rapid degradation of the plant and Gosses wilt.
While there's nothing they can do now, what should producers do in the future for those fields?
Well, in general, I hope that if they already have a history of Goss's wilt, which is where we're likely to see this, I hope they'll continue to select resistant hybrids. But with that said, even a good tolerant or resistant hybrid is still going to be sensitive to the systemic wilt phase of this disease.
What other bacterial problems are in the state?
Well, there's a variety of things going on right now. There's a few other bacterial diseases like the bacterial stalk rot, and people that are familiar with that one will recognize the odor more than anything because it is so stinky. There's a few other things going on. We're just beginning to see a little bit of common smut develop, and that's common after hail events or other injury events too.
The bacterial stalk rot, would those be in areas that might have leached nitrogen?
Well, or more likely areas where we've had ponding in fields,
okay.
And when we've had hot temperatures and a lot of water standing, we tend to see things like that.
How much of a problem could that be later in the season?
Well, any of these stalk rot diseases could cause lodging later in the season. Bacterial stalk rot tends to kill plants early in the season, but if we have any kind of stress like we are now, injury or ponding in fields, we need to watch the fields the rest of the season and be ready to prioritize harvest order in case stalk rots develop later.
And how can producers know if they have some bacterial issues?
Well, if they begin to see plants that are starting to wilt or become discolored, it'd be a good idea to go out and to dig up or pluck a few of them up and go ahead and split those stems and stalks all the way down through the crown and look for discoloration, brown lesions down around the roots and in that crown, and take a smell, see if it's kind of got that rotting odor smell. That's a good indication that we can have some bacterial infections going on or even fungal.
Has common smut been a problem so far for Nebraska producers?
Well, you know, we see a little common smut every year, and we don't usually worry about it, but it might surprise people to know that it will develop on the leaves, and it looks quite a bit different. Instead of the characteristic mushroom-like galls that people are used to seeing on the ears and tassels and stalks, when it develops on the leaves themselves, it might look more like warts or bumps. And so that might surprise some people, but this is common smut, and I wouldn't worry about it.
In any of this field corn, seed corn, or sweet corn?
Right now, there is nothing showing up yet that we know we can treat, and so I'd hang out and watch and be patient and submit samples to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic for diagnoses.
Again, you can find information on submitting samples to UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic on our website. The June Nebraska Farmer tells a story of young farmers promoting the ag industry, even though they're parents of 3 young children. On this month's cover and in an inside feature, the magazine tells a story of Greg and Megan Coles of Laurel. Megan writes books for kids and is a regional director for the Nebraska Farm Bureau. Greg raises corn and soybeans and is involved in a cow-calf operation near Whitney. You can learn how this family keeps a balance in their lives by reading the June Nebraska Farmer. U.S. farmers over the last 10 years have quickly adopted genetically engineered corn and soybean varieties. In 2013, 90% of corn and 93% of soybeans in the country were a genetically engineered variety. Recently, some states have looked into whether or not that food in the grocery store should be labeled as genetically modified. Earlier this year, Vermont passed a mandatory GMO labeling law that would take effect in July 2016. UNL Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubin joined us earlier this week to talk about the reasons for and against GM labeling.
Well, we've seen GM labeling pop up in quite a few policy issues. We've seen ballot issues, particularly the big issue in California that did go down in a vote, but a ballot issue brought by a petition of citizens to put GM labeling on the ballot. We now have action in several New England states, including most recently and most significantly Vermont, passing freestanding legislation to require GM labeling on food products.
What is the argument for labeling? What is the argument against labeling?
We have this big debate about labeling and the information it provides to consumers, the information it could provide to consumers that have preferences for GM versus non-GM products. But frankly, we also have a lot of policy questions about the potential misinformation it provides to consumers. The current labeling regime in the U.S. nationally would be that once a product is deemed safe and equivalent, there is no label to distinguish it. So there is no specific GM label on food products because GM products have gone through testing and been deemed to be safe. You could compare that at one end of the extreme that essentially says no labeling once a product is safe and equivalent to a precautionary principle as is used in the European Union, which essentially has banned most GM products from even approval, out of precaution that it may in fact be dangerous or hazardous. Not out of proof, but out of precaution. You've got this policy regime that stretches from approval and no labeling to outright disapproval. You've got this labeling debate in the United States that currently sits somewhere in the middle.
Is there a concern that the consumer's maybe not well enough informed and labeling a product with GM would scare them away from buying?
Right. Look at the labeling debate that's currently going on, and it's a mandatory label. There is also the option of a voluntary label, and food companies could pursue a voluntary label today if they chose to determine the specifications of a product and clarify those in terms of the intent of a label. We really have a choice, I think we have a policy choice ahead of us between mandatory labeling versus voluntary labeling. A voluntary label signifies and delivers to consumers information specifically about what they choose to purchase and consume. A mandatory label puts a stamp on every product that consumers might want to avoid, but it might provide information that they want. It might also provide a stigma that suggests this product is not as safe or as wholesome as what testing has shown.
Are there any parallels here with the lean, finely textured beef where some consumers felt they weren't informed enough on the product, but now that beef prices are rising, it's starting to gain another place?
Well, I think there are parallels between the labeling questions of a GM product, which some question the technology, and the labeling questions of a lean, finely textured beef product, which was effectively taken out of the market in terms of the stigma that was attached to all the media discussion of the product. You could also compare it to organic labels or country of origin labeling, which is also up for debate yet at the moment. There is a role for labeling to provide information to consumers, to help them choose products, to help them express their preferences in the marketplace, to help them return and put a value on that experience or that attribute. The big question becomes whether it's mandatory or voluntary. In the case of organic, it's a label that is defined so that people that choose to produce organic and certify it as such can label it. In the case of GM, it's currently proposed in Vermont. It's required to label the product if it contains it. The debate nationally will move to legislation that's being proposed for a mandatory label at the national level versus legislation that's being proposed to define a voluntary label. And that's the debate we'll have to play out.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. A fairly devastating week for portions of northeast Nebraska. Of course, we had the large tornado that hit Pilger, and then subsequently the next night we seen another large tornado near the Coleridge area. Very heavy rainfall. We had totals ranging in the extreme northeastern portion of the state between 5 and 9 inches. Some of our isolated spots. Further southwest through central and south central Nebraska, general 1 to 2 inch rainfalls and more spottier rainfall to the southeast and to the west of this region. In fact, the driest area of the state overall was the Panhandle, where we just seen some scattered shower activity. Now, we did have a twin tornado system with this Pilger tornado, very rare circumstance where we had an individual cell that really had no competition from any other cells developing around it and was able to sustain itself for long-lived. And this was part of a larger scale complex that dropped tremendous volumes of precipitation across northwest Nebraska, or northwest Iowa, southeast South Dakota, and southwest Minnesota. And we had weekly totals approaching a foot in the Fall City area, and that's why we have all the flood warnings. Now, it does look like a little bit of a drier trend as we get into northeast Nebraska during this next 7-day period. And the heaviest of precipitation will remain south of us, but there is still opportunities for additional thunderstorm activity during this next 7-day period. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we may have in store. The thing I'll draw your attention to is that we do have a troughing pattern in the western United States, and the main flow is going to take most of the energy just to the immediately north of Nebraska. So for this afternoon, the best opportunity for thunderstorm activity will be across extreme north central northeast Nebraska, with lesser chances as you get toward the south. Now, this same troughing pattern is expected to move across the northern plains, and it will sag the front a little bit farther southward. So we may see some activity generating during the morning hours across southern Nebraska Nebraska, and then most of eastern Nebraska does have a decent shot of precipitation, particularly as we get into Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, and we will see some of that residual activity hanging into eastern Nebraska as we get into Monday. And notice this trough starts to strengthen, and it will strengthen even farther as it gets toward the Great Lakes, and that's going to push some cool air toward the south and to the west, and that will mean a cooling trend during the early part of the week, and some of that moisture will butt up against the Rockies, so we will see the chance for thunderstorm activity across the Panhandle in southeastern Nebraska, particularly as we get in the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday time frame. So here you can see that the system is trying to push down, pushing that warmer air toward the southwest. This will be our main activity area for thunderstorm development. Some of this may creep into southeastern Nebraska. But as we get into Wednesday, we'll start to see that system moving toward the Great Lakes, and we'll start to see some warmer air trying to build back in. So our temperatures are going to move right back up to normal conditions as we get into Wednesday across western Nebraska. And as we get into Thursday, we'll really start to see this ridge pumping some warm air, and so everybody should be in the 90s. And would not be surprised, we'll see some upper 90s across southwest Nebraska with some isolated thunderstorms possible. And then that ridge is firmly in place as we get into Friday. We could be looking at mid to upper 90s consistently across southwest, maybe even some low 100-degree readings with a chance for scattered thunderstorm activity. So we look at the temperature forecast, we are looking for that chance of thunderstorms off and on during this period. The best activity will be basically across the southern and southeastern part of the state, lesser chances across the northeast. Now as we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we see above normal temperatures taking hold across most of the northern plains, and precipitation is expected to be below normal. The new forecast for the summer months, July, August, and September, indicates colder than normal conditions and above normal moisture from the southwest to the northern plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews on wheat markets, corn and soybean diseases, GM labeling, as well as Al's weather forecast can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Luke Beckman will join us to analyze corn and soybean markets leading up to the June 30th USDA reports on quarterly grain stocks and planted acres. Iowa State Extension livestock economist Shane Ellis will also be with us to look at supply and demand in the cattle markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.